Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each Thursday, live, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, on Contact Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. It's a radio show about astrology, art, spiritual adventure. And to me, they're all connected. In some way, astrology is a reflection of cycles and circles that we see within the realm of the universe. And at the same time, we have all of these other aspects with dealing with art, and which is an expression of the soul. And we have the concepts of design and function and angle and degree. They all connect somehow in a sort of a soup, if you will, for lack of a better word, of ideas that all point to an underlying logic. And our topic today is going to be about this sort of logic and how it reflects itself through the planetary alignments as well as through the manifestation of architecture and buildings on the ground, and how form and function and line and angle all coalesce to form a master plan, if you will. And the topic today is going to be on sacred architecture. And my guest is his name is Tad Mann, A.T. Mann, M-A-N-N. And he's a remarkable architect, astrologer, author, artist, designer, and a miraculous forward thinker. He's been able to sort of coalesce all these great topics together that I love so much, and has been able to come up with a logic and a purpose for what we are all working towards and where we all fit in this planet. And it certainly has an enormous richness to it, because it brings in this sense of purpose and logic that I think is sometimes we're all looking for. When we can find this logic within the realm of the universe, we really have a very strong idea of what's going on and where things stand. Before we get any further, I want to just go through a few quick planetary things that are going to be happening in the next week or so. We've got two big events coming up next week. On September the 8th, both Pluto and Jupiter will be going direct, which is big news because they've been retrograde for a while. When these two planets go direct, we can expect to see major changes and shakeups with regard, and especially whenever Jupiter is involved, we can expect them to be large events because of the fact that they are so. Jupiter is the planet of expansion, and it's the largest planet in the solar system, next to the sun, and it's also a indicator of large events happening. So we have an awful lot of significant things happening in the world today with regard to large institutions, especially with regard to political conventions, as we know, with the sort of the lining up of the natural world order. And there's a lot of controversy with regard to the way many things are unfolding on the planet these days. And we are all due for a significant change of some sort. We can almost see the storm clouds gathering. And I hate to use the word storm clouds because that sort of implies negativity. It's not that it's going to be negative, I don't think. I think that all change ultimately is for the higher good. And, part of the purpose of this whole understanding and the purpose of the show is to sort of provide people with some sort of insight into how those things begin to unfold. We have a great deal of knowledge in our behest, in our hands, and we need to be able to understand how that logic works. And this is the purpose of the show, sort of understanding how these things begin to coalesce. Now, today we've got the sun is at 12 degrees Virgo, the moon is at 11 degrees Scorpio, Mercury, Venus, and Mars are all sitting in and around 8 to 10 degrees of Libra, which is interesting because they're all there conjoining together in a marvelous Libra energy. Libra, as you know, is all about balance. It's about, weighing both sides of an issue, beginning to see both sides of an issue, and coming up with some conclusion. Having Venus there, Mercury there, and Mars there all indicate, I think, it's a very strong time for relationships with regard, because you've got Venus, which is the planet of love and relationships. You've got Mercury, which is all about a communication, and you've got Mars, which is all about forward motion and motive. Okay, well, my guest is here, and I want to welcome Tad Mann. Tad has been a friend of mine for a couple of years, and I met him through our mutual interest. He's an architect that has designed buildings. He's a famous astrologer that has written widely on astrology, and he's a very much of a pioneer in that regard. His vision of astrology is a little bit different than others, but it comes up with some very rich symbology and imagery with pointing to the way astrology and the charts can be read. We're not going to be discussing that today too much with Tad, although we can. He's also an author. He's working on a book right now on sacred landscape. But we're here today to talk about sacred architecture. And Tad is one of the few people on the planet, I think, who has a really good grasp of this because he is an architect, an author, a designer, an artist, an astrologer. He has all this within his realm of knowledge, and he's very, very adept in all this. So, Tad, welcome to Turning of the Wheel. Hello? Tad, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
There you are. I could feel your spirit. I wasn't quite sure that you were here in voice. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, I was just telling the audience of your background and how you are probably one of the few people who can address this topic better than anybody that I know, because you've got such a wide realm, a wide reach of information and knowledge about all the different topics that come under the umbrella of sacred architecture. And so I'd like to begin just by asking you your opinion of what sacred architecture really implies in the word, because I think people assume that it just means that we're going off and designing cathedrals, but I think it's more than that. I think it's a much richer, broader topic than just designing churches and cathedrals. So I'm curious as to what your definition of sacred architecture is.
Yes, well, you know, it's necessary to define what the word sacred really means. And the word sacred is an interesting one because it doesn't necessarily have a religious connotation.
Mm-hmm.
But the sacred basically shows that a particular place or a building is in some way looked upon as being an avenue or a way of understanding a higher level of knowledge about the world. And it's a sacred place when you speak to the divine there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the ancient world, certain sacred places were unique because they were places where people felt the gods came down to earth. And this is an issue in sacred architecture, but also in the book I'm writing at the moment. Things like the mountain, high mountains have always been seen as sacred because they reach up to heaven. It looks like it's the place where the gods come down to earth.
Mm-hmm,
but
right.
Also, they symbolize the whole idea of ascent, you know, of moving up and moving towards a point that's high, a higher vantage point maybe. And
yeah, ascension of some sort towards a higher purpose or goal. Right.
Exactly. So what happens historically is very interesting because, you know, in early times when humanity is nomadic and wanders around, the sacred mountains become very, very powerful places where, for example, to retrieve the tables of the law. But then as architecture starts happening, it seems natural for them to make architecture that reflects the sacred mountain. Get a building like the Great Pyramid, for example.
Right, or the same thing is true with churches and their spires that reach towards the sky.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Cathedrals are sacred mountains, and pyramids are sacred mountains, whether the pyramids in Egypt or the pyramids in Central America, places like Machu Picchu in Peru. They all basically are places where people go to receive some kind of spiritual guidance. And another interesting aspect about the sacred is that it isn't just the place itself, but rather they're places that actually trigger an understanding when you go experience it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting now, you know, when we talk about sacred architecture, to me, of course, there's people within different dogmas that would attribute different meanings to different placement and different architecture within their realms. In other words, the Buddhists might have a temple that relates something to them. The Roman Catholic Church may have a cathedral that does something to them. Is there an element of sacred architecture that is sort of universal regardless of the dogma attached?
Yes, I think there are a number of basic principles that are in common when you look at many different cultures and look at their sacred architecture. One of those, of course, is geometry. You know, the whole idea, and it's interesting because, of course, geometry in sacred architecture is very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it derives from ideas that are connected to astrology, for example. But one of the primary ones is the idea of the square and the circle because, you know, from time immemorial, the square or the cube is related to man and to earth. I mean humanity and to the earth. And in fact, it's always seen as a very feminine shape, whereas the sky is seen as being a circle or a sphere or a hemisphere. So you get this idea of heaven being associated with a circle and earth being associated with either a square or a cross.
Interesting. I would always have thought of the square as being more masculine, just because of the hard edges. I always think of the circle as being more maternal because of the fact that it has soft edges and is sort of, I sort of envision a womb and sort of that, that comforting aspect of the circle.
Maybe you have German heritage because
I do.
because within the German mythology, the moon is the sun.
You're breaking up a little bit there.
Yeah, but within Germanic mythology, the sun is seen as being feminine and the moon is masculine. But the general idea of it is that the number 4 and the square and the cross are associated with Earth because they represent the 4 directions.
Right.
They
4 points of the compass, right.
4 points of the compass, north, south, east, and west. And in every single religious culture, sacred buildings are oriented to that axis. And again, in some cases it might be the north-south axis. In Christianity, you probably know it's along the east-west axis, where, the entryway to a cathedral is almost always due east, so that the rising sun actually enters the long axis of the cathedral.
I see, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And so the idea of Earth being basically this, in very early cultures also, part of the reason why the cube is associated with Earth is in very early cultures they actually thought that the Earth was like a cube sitting in space, and that we were in a kind of chamber that had like an opening at the top, which was the sky.
Interesting.
And so this idea kind of was maintained in the sense that, Christian architecture, for example, as well as Islamic architecture, is often characterized by a kind of cross shape in the bottom, but with a dome on the top of it. And that is really an integration in sacred architecture terms of the earth as being the cross or the square or the cube, and the dome on top of it represents heaven and the higher domain. And they even actually painted them that way. They painted the insides of early domes dark blue and painted stars on them and constellations and moons and various other things.
Yeah, aside from the orientation of the actual building, as you mentioned earlier, the north, south, east, west, was any heed given to the idea of the actual position within the placement of the planet? In other words, the coordinates as far as latitude, longitude, were those things taken into account with regard to, when the early buildings were constructed?
Well, yes, of course. If you realize that the latitude of a particular place on the planet gives you certain locations for rising sun and setting sun, particularly around the 4 cardinal points of the year, which are the 2 solstices, the winter solstice and the summer solstice, as well as the equinoxes. So the rising and setting suns were significant on those days, particularly in early farming cultures, because it meant that the winter solstice symbolized the middle point of the winter, and it meant days were going to start getting warmer. And so people would begin to prepare to plant towards the end of winter. And basically they were very tight with these kind of early on. And so it would be natural if you were dedicating a building or a temple basically to achieve fertility in your particular tribe, that you'd probably orient it towards the rising sun because that was seen as being a life-giving force. Similarly, the place where you buried your dead or did sacrifices to the dead or worshiped the dead are typically in the west, which is where the setting sun is.
Interesting, yeah, which would make sense, as far as the orientation. And that's part of why I think that's where the aspect of astrology, I think, comes in very clearly, because it is about placement and time, and all those aspects begin to coalesce into that building. And I think the building, in some way, a building, and especially sacred architecture, is a manifestation of that energy and of that sort of intention, especially with regard to, making that connection to the other world in some way.
Well, absolutely. It's like in many early cultures, once again, the temple was really seen as being a microcosm, which means the small world, or a kind of replica on a small scale of the way they saw the universe on a large scale. So it was like saying if the gods created heaven and earth, then if we make a little place where heaven is symbolized and earth is symbolized, then we'll have access to the power of the gods. So,
yeah.
and whether you see that as being a godly process like the Greeks, or a monotheistic one like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, the whole idea is that you're creating a little replica of heaven and earth, and in a sense, it's like almost like kind of sympathetic magic in a way, in that you're bringing the spirit, you're inviting the spirit to come and inhabit the building or the space. That's why people create little altars in their houses, you know.
Right, exactly the same idea. It's sort of like a holographic representation of of a smaller, the micro, evolving into the macro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea is that it kind of grows out of this whole idea of kind of a sympathetic magic, meaning that if you recreate the symbols of heaven and earth, in your own house, then you're creating like a little, almost like a creation myth of your own, and it's a very, very interesting metaphor.
Mm. Now, how would something that was considered to be sacred architecture, say, compare with something that was considered to be sacred or occult architecture? Something sort of the inverse. How would those two line up, and would there be the same amount of detail placed in that?
Well, I mean, that whole dynamic shows up quite a lot because, and I'll give you a very good example, that the very earliest kind of religious culture that we know about was actually the time of the Earth Mother cults, like 20,000 years ago, the caves of Lascaux, mm-hmm. and places like that. And during that time, they worshipped caves, simply because they hadn't built buildings yet. Buildings didn't exist. Cities didn't exist.
Protection, yeah.
Yeah, and the cave was protection, but also it was a place that was mysterious. It was a place of terror, and very often there would be bears living in caves, or cave lions and things like that. So in these early cultures, the whole idea of the cave became sacred to many of the cults, where they worshipped animal cults and so on. And similarly, they were associated very early on with the kind of fertility, because it was like a womb. So what began happening when they created early architecture is that there would be a place like under Chartres Cathedral, which is west of Paris,
right,
and built around 1150 A.D., one of the greatest cathedrals, is actually built on the site of a cave that went into the ground and was a cave where the black goddess was worshipped. And when they built Chartres, she became converted into the Black Virgin, which was a very common culture around Europe at that time. And what the Catholics did, and what many of these, like Judaism, also did, was they basically took these earlier cult places and chose to place their temples or their churches on top of them. And they transformed the earlier goddesses into something more, to their mind, a bit more modern. So, the black goddess, the fertility goddess who was worshipped at Chartres, there are all kinds of spiraling water channels around it. There's crosses of underground water that meet directly under the altar. And in fact, to this day, there's an altar to the Black Virgin underneath the altar at Chartres.
So that's sort of like they sort of faced their fears at that point. They sort of just stood up and sort of acknowledged this and then brought that spirit in.
Exactly. Another example, which is a book that I'm going to be writing next year about sacred trees. And of course, they show up both in sacred architecture and in sacred landscapes. But within Hebrew culture, the very earliest goddesses of Hebrew, one of them was a goddess called Asherah, and she was often seen as being Jehovah's wife, believe it or not. And one of the working titles for this book is Mrs. God, which is partially tongue-in-cheek, but the whole idea is that all of these early Middle Eastern goddesses were associated with tree cults, and they were worshipped in groves of trees. And again, it was kind of pre-architecture. So
the trees, I think, have a direct connection with architecture because they are sort of Earth architecture. There's Earth. They are one of the largest of Earth creations, and they sort of, have the same symbolicness that they rise up through the sky and they cover and they protect us in some ways, and they are probably seen as early cover for many people.
Absolutely. They also send their roots down in the world. So, their go up into heaven. Their roots
They're symbolic on many different levels, absolutely. You know, the thing about Chartres, I think, is also interesting is the fact that the two spires are not symmetrical. They are totally different, and there must have been something about the way that building was designed that made them do that, because there's no other cathedral that I know of that has that same asymmetry about it. Is there others? Are there others?
A lot of them are asymmetrical. Yeah, simply because, you know, at Chartres, the entryway faces east, the altar is to the west, and so the idea then basically is that I think the shorter wing of Chartres faces the south and the taller wing faces the north. And, you know, there are symbolisms associated with those four directions. I mean, they show up in Western architecture. They also show up in Eastern architecture and feng shui, for example, you know, where the south is seen as a place which is very life-giving and affirming and very bright and very positive. And, of course, the north is a place that's much darker, it's much bluer in color, it's more inward-looking. There are symbolisms of all these places, and in the cathedrals, whether it was a north rose window or a south rose window, made a huge significance in terms of describing the mysteries of Christianity.
Now, what is the rose window? What is its actual place? What is its purpose within the cathedral? Now, for those of you who don't know, the rose window are the beautiful circular windows that have that wonderful geometry in there that's very representative of a mandala in the sort of the facing of in the very eastern and western parts of the cathedral. They have the huge colored glass windows. What is their significance in the cathedral itself or in the building?
Well, they're many-fold. You know, a great friend of mine is really the world authority on rose windows, and I've helped illustrate two of his books. One of them was called Rose Windows that went back to the 70s, and the other one was just published in London. It's called, also I think it's called The Rose Window. But the point is that around the time the rose windows started appearing around 1100, if you think about it, first of all, there were no books because the printing press hadn't been invented yet.
Right, okay.
A majority of people, if you weren't in the church, you probably didn't know how to read, and there were no books to read in any event. So the common people, the only way they could actually learn about the history of the church, about symbolism, was through images. And so the rose windows in the cathedrals were ways to, in a sense, educate people, to show them how beautiful the kind of mysteries could be. And they educated them as to the, you know, some of the cathedrals are dedicated to the 12 disciples, and others are dedicated to the 12 prophets. Of course, there's a lot of astrological symbolism in them, but in general, the whole idea is that one of the ways Chartres was seen, and I talk about that in my book, is that it was like a kind of encyclopedia of its time, with the engravings inside and the stonework that was carved, and a lot of religious iconography was the kind of thing people would never have seen before, and they saw it as intensely magical, and it had a profound effect on them.
But for such a long time to create that stuff, I mean, it was really a living history.
Oh, yes, it was. That's exactly what it was, and it would, you know, because the noble people of the area would be buried in it, like Westminster Abbey in England, you know, these places were seen as being like a kind of historical monument. Very much like, you know, the tree we were talking about before. At around this time, the tree gets transformed into things like the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, and the idea of the family tree, or the idea of the tree of life in Judaism.
Right. They all have a double meaning, a dualistic meaning. They have a literal and a metaphorical meaning, which is very resonant, I think, in many of the sort of the symbols that we use within astrology as well as in other sort of divinations. It always seems to be there. These are very common themes, which makes me wonder, when you think about these civilizations evolving in parallel, different parts of the world, and yet they all come up with sort of similar ideas. I mean, at their core, there's a universality there that was not known to each other at the time that they were developed. Is that true?
Absolutely. Well, you know, if you look at these general motifs that I was talking about, like the sacred mountain, the sacred cave, another thing that is always sacred are things like the river, or water, the ocean, the seas, the whole idea of flow, and all kinds of things like this, the sacred tree, that all of these symbolisms or gateways or boundaries or walls are all aspects of every single culture, and they show up in different ways, but the myths end up being very, very similar. In another myth that up often in sacred architecture, as well as in kind of esoteric studies, is the idea of the snake or the serpent, which is basically symbolizes the feminine. And since the feminine was associated with birth, she was also associated with death, because by bringing individuals into the world, the feminine also, of course, condemns them to an eventual death at some stage. So,
right. Once you begin that process, once the birth is begun, the death also begins. I said, right?
That's right. I mean, by being mortal, you condemn yourself to, at some point, dying. So a lot of the mysteries involve this kind of dualistic aspect of the feminine, and of course, because it's associated with the moon that has a dark side and a light side, and the moon's movement around the Earth every month has a cycle for 3 days when it disappears that has often been compared and associated with the mystery of Christianity. But what you get then is the idea of the snake becoming associated with time. So the snake or the serpent shows up in all of these cultures as a symbol of earth energy. Qi, it's called in China, or,
right.
Psychic energy in the West, and that, in feng shui or Chinese sacred architecture, for example, one of the things you try to do is to try to tap into the earth energy of the place where you live.
Why do you think the snake is feared so much throughout mythology, and why is it seen as such a negative connotation?
Well, I think partially because it always relates back symbolically to the thousands of years when it was associated with not just cults of the living, but also death cults. It's seen as an animal that's very threatening. It's also seen as a symbol of metamorphosis and rebirth, because, the snake sheds its skin once a year and leaves, that skin is like a trace of its old being. So people were afraid of it, but they also were afraid of it in the same way that in early cultures sexuality was often seen as something to be feared.
It's interesting. Those are some very strong embedded, social, triggers. I know that I have a barn at my house, and I found a snake in my studio's in my barn as well, and I found a snake in there, and my first reaction was of fear, and gosh, I got to get rid of this. And then the longer I sat with the idea of the snake, I said, something, as long as he doesn't bother me, I'm not going to bother him. And so now we're sort of coexisting together in a very harmonious way. I sort of avoid him, and he avoids me. It's kind of funny.
I have two cats, and I came in last summer one day, and I heard this hiss on the second, and there was a small snake that probably 18 or 20 inches.
Yeah. Hey, you're breaking up a little bit, I think.
That idea of the snake is really very powerful, and it shows up in all this.
Well, it's sort of nice to be able to accept it and to move on with it. Listen, Tab, we're going to take a 2-minute break right now to run some propaganda commercials, and we'll be back in just a second here. Our guest today is Tad Mann. He's an architect, an astrologer, an author, an artist, and a wonderful source of knowledge. And we're talking about sacred architecture today. If you have any questions you want to call in with, you can at 1-877-230-3062. Be they about astrology or architecture, we can talk about those topics. We'll be right back in about 2.5 minutes, so stay tuned.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me, 978-264-0668. That's 978-264-0668. www.chrisflisher.com. As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.chrisflisher.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. At www.chrisflisher.com. www.chrisflisher.com and enter a world of possibility and color.
Be part of the show. Call now at contacttalkradio.com at 1-877-230-3062.
Welcome back, everyone, to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher, and today we're talking about sacred architecture. My guest is Tad Mann. He's a friend of mine who's an astrologer, an architect, and a wellspring of fascinating information that spans many different divination tools and sort of coalesces in a wonderful logic and sort of sense of purpose to the way the world resolves. You know, the world revolves based on a series of very mathematical, geometric schemes of axioms and lines and form and function degrees, all sort of coalesce into a sort of underlying logic here. And we're talking about sacred architecture because it is about placement and time and meaning and the symbology of what the sacred architecture means. But also, it encompasses many different cultures. And we were talking during the break about the concept of feng shui and how feng shui relates to placement. And placement is very critical when it comes to architecture. Now, Tab, when buildings are built in Western society, they don't dip into feng shui the way other cultures do, say, in China. How would those two sort of manifest themselves? I mean, they're sort of working with the same sort of logic, but one is using a very different set of parameters to choose the siting of that building versus what Western people might do. And I'm wondering, did Western architects refer to, what sort of things did they refer to when they were designing their buildings? What sort of things did they draw on?
There's a very simple answer to that, Chris. They don't.
Okay.
In fact, that's one of the great problems that I encountered when I was in school, because I kept expecting to hear about a kind of knowledge of these things that maybe the Freemasons knew about or something, but it never really happened, and it really still hasn't happened. If you think about it, a lot of people who build houses, for example, they buy a cookie-cutter house and they put it down on the lot so that the front door faces the street.
Right.
You know, the Chinese would consider that mad simply because, you know, if there's any kind of slope on the site, then the Chinese think that the high part of the site needs to be behind you and the entryway needs to come up from the low part of the site, which is very natural. You know, it's kind of, once again, like these archetypes of the shapes in sacred architecture, a lot of the orientation is really about very early survival instincts that if you don't really maintain them or if you're not really aware of them, then it creates a kind of uncertainty about you that really could be problematic. I mean, one of these issues is...
Yeah, that energy sort of transpires, too. I mean, it's all about sort of covering your back. You know, you really want to cover your back, and you sort of want to get yourself into a position where you're sort of protected. And I think it's a matter of that whole logic extending from a very primal time as man evolved.
That's right. Like one of the main ones is, and any of you out there listening can actually try this, is when you lay in bed on the side where you normally lie at night, can you see the door of your bedroom or not? And which way does that door open? When someone comes in, can they see you before you see them? And if it's true that someone coming into the bedroom can see you before you see them, then it will give you a sense of trepidation. It's very much like I did a feng shui consultation a few years ago for a woman. She and her family had built and bought a multi-million-dollar house near here in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and her study that she built on the second floor, she began taking over more of her office work from New York and doing it there, and her business began declining in a precipitous way. And what I noticed that when he came up the stairs into this room where her study was, she was facing a brick wall, and you came up directly behind her. And it was really kind of counterintuitive in a way, because it basically meant that there was a kind of, there were uncertain and unknown forces acting on her from below. I said that would be the symbolism of displacement.
Right, yeah.
And she said she actually felt in her business as though there were unseen forces acting on her that she had no control over. And so I literally said to her, and she's a very proper lady, usually used to having other people do things for her, I said, you and I are going to turn your desk around right now. She said, what? And basically the two of us moved it, and I said, well, this is significant also, because it's not just moving the furniture that's significant. It's the fact that you decided and made a choice to actually bring this into being, and that you did it yourself with your own hands.
It's very critical. I think that hiring somebody to do it would not have the same effect.
It wouldn't have the same effect, and we turned the desk around so that instead of facing she said she felt overwhelmed by all kinds of issues, and on this wall in front of her desk were thousands of little sticky pieces of paper saying, you know, take the garbage out, pay this check, do that. I said, that's the last thing you want to look at every day.
Right.
So we basically reoriented the desk so she could see people coming into the room and looked out over this beautiful woodland view. And within a few months, her business turned around completely.
And I think people underestimate the power of this sort of this placement because of the simple fact that they don't really, it's not something as tangible as going out and reaching out and turning a light switch off and on and seeing dark and light happen. It's a very gradual thing, but underneath it is this sense of intention and that permeates and has a very slow build that eventually begins to take over, because you do change your perspective based on that. I mean, looking at a beautiful wooded view versus a bunch of a wall of sticky notes has got to be better. I think then that's critical. And what I think is unusual, especially in this country, when you look into many of the office spaces that many people occupy, they all live in a cubicle, and the cubicles all have their backs to the door, which is very unnatural from a feng shui standpoint.
That's right. And you know, it's like the point is that people are so divorced from their instincts and divorced from reality that they end up really being profoundly unhappy regardless of their state of income or the situation of their families. And I think a lot of what I'm trying to teach through sacred architecture or through sacred landscapes is basically a different kind of awareness, meaning to become aware of these symbols and to become aware that placement means something rather than just being a kind of insignificant factor.
Right. And so now, when you work with that placement and you work with the astrology of the individual, you can actually find some of the best placements for those people to manifest their greatest higher need and higher purpose as a result of living through that process of placement, time, and form and function, and how they all coalesce under that umbrella of logic. And it's very valid for people to understand that. Now, Tad is an astrologer, professional astrologer, written a number of books. His website is atmann.net. It's MANN.net. He's available for consultations. He's written many books. He's also been the author of several software programs, one of which is this Tarot, which is
Mandala Astrological Tarot. Yeah.
Yeah. And why don't you explain a little bit about that? Because I think that all sort of ties in with this as well.
Yeah, well, the first report I wrote for Tarot.com, which has remained one of their more successful ones, is based on a tarot deck that I designed and painted originally in the early 70s, and then repainted it for publication by Harper and Row in 1987. It's actually just about to be republished by Barnes & Noble this next year.
That's great.
But the idea of the book is that I use these cards as a way of learning tarot myself, and it's called mandala because they're actually circular images within a square card, and it's astrological because every single card in the deck is associated with one of the astrological signs or a planet or a combination of the two. So the idea.
How many cards are there in the deck?
The same number, 78.
78. Okay.
No, there are 22.
So you've got a combination. You've got a combination of planets, signs, aspects. Elements. Planet, signs, and elements, okay. And then a combination of the two.
Yeah, exactly. So the good thing about it is if you know even a little bit about astrology, if you know a little bit about the sun signs, then and a little bit about tarot, then you can put these two pieces of information together, and maybe it can mean that on the right-hand part of a reading, which is about partnership, and maybe you see an Aries card, maybe that means that you're looking for an Aries woman or an Aries man. You know,
do you see them as an oracle? Would you use them as an oracle?
You can use it as anything you like, but it has a psychological component. It also has a kind of oracular or fortune-telling component. And again, I see this as permeates all of my work and my studies, that a lot of these things function both on the outside level and on the inside, meaning that by understanding where you're headed, it's going to teach you something about yourself, and that by understanding the symbols, it's like learning to read a road sign, you know?
Yes, you got 12 signs, 9 planets, 4 elements, right?
Hmm?
And then it's the combination of the rest of those that equal up to 72.
Right, that's right.
So now, would you combine planets and elements, or would you combine signs and planets together?
Well, of course you do. In a reading, you get all kinds of combinations, and that indeed tells you something also, because the planets tend to represent individuals in your life. They're personifications, and the signs of the zodiac represent particular ways of behaving and mechanisms, and the minor arcana, which are like the number cards in a playing card deck, the 1, 2, 3, up to 10, represent in the astrological context, they're called decanates. They're 10-degree divisions of the zodiac, and they represent a planet and a sign. So, like the 2 of Cups can represent the moon in the sign Cancer.
I see.
And it represents really a kind of very specific little mechanism. A particular, in that case, the 2 of Cups means someone's very changeable in terms of how they feel at a given time.
How do you feel about the accuracy? Have you seen manifestation of that? Have you seen it being a very accurate representation of the person and time and place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely prejudiced in this sense, because
I understand
I've always liked tarot. I've always found it to be very, very accurate. One of the first tarot reading I ever had was just astonishing to me, because it told me things that I didn't have a clue about myself, and which came into being. I just find that it's a great tool. You know, I use it for other people, but I equally use it for myself. I mean, on each birthday, I do a 12-card reading using my deck that spans, 1 card per month for the next 12 months. And you can also do it on New Year's Day. And in fact, on tarot.com, if you look at the mandala astrological tarot readings, you can do a 4-card reading for $2 or something. It's very inexpensive, but you'll see it really gives you a kind of insight. And just the way I write is not really, a lot of such oracular things you see online are not very committal. They don't really say very much, and I like being a bit confrontational. So the writing is quite confrontational. It might say, if you get a Leo card, I'm a Leo myself, but it might say, your ego is getting a bit too big, and something's going to happen that'll equalize that.
How do you feel about hard aspects in the chart? I tend to think of them as being actually very good, but I'm curious what your take is.
Well, I think they represent opportunities to change.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that, if you don't want to change, then it can represent a challenge.
Right. I guess that's really what it comes down to. That's a very succinct way of looking at it. I think that, the opportunity is the right word, because I think that I've always stressed the point that that anytime there's a tension in the chart, it indicates that there's a need for some sort of motion. And if without that impetus, we don't move forward. It's sort of almost that Mars-like energy that needs to be there to force that action to come about, just so that you do fulfill your higher purpose. And if you don't fulfill your higher purpose, you do meet with obstacles.
Well, I mean, everything is changing, and the whole idea that I see as being just kind of axiomatic, whether you're talking about astrology or tarot or sacred architecture or whatever, it's kind of axiomatic that moving and changing is alive, and when you stop changing and stop moving, it's like a death in a way.
It's stagnant,
I think it's like life is a continual adaptation, and nothing remains the same for very long, and if it does, it gets a little stagnant, stale. So I always think that the best approach is that when the omens and when all kinds of rational ways of looking at things say to you, hey, it's not working right now, something needs to change, then you need to really learn how to facilitate that kind of change. And rather than looking at it as something bad happening to you, the idea, I think, is to look at it in such a way that you're embracing what happens. It's like embracing the possibilities.
Right. I always use the idea of, if the train leaves at 6:15 and you're not there, well, especially in Europe, maybe not so much in this country, but if the train leaves at 6:15 and you're not there, it's going to leave without you. So you need to, the pressure, the tension that you need to get there, or April 15th to get your taxes filed, the tension you need to get there is a stressful point, is a stressful aspect. It does make you feel stressed because you're rushing to get to the train. But that is the motion that gets you to there to get you to the next place. You need to have that impetus, that motive has to be there in order for
another way of looking at it is the situation that I've experienced many times, because I do astrology readings often on a regular basis and have done for 36 or 7 years. Similarly with tarot is, if a husband comes to me and says, my wife is really problematic, I think there's something, disturbed about her psychologically, I can't get her to go see a therapist. My solution to that is that I think you should go see a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the best way. If you go and show some kind of positive improvement about who you are, that's the best possible message. And, of course, the guy goes, and he actually discovers a whole other world in himself. And so in the end, the idea is that whatever you see happening around you, whatever you see someone else doing it to you or in a particular way that's threatening to you, in my mind, that's showing you something about yourself that you need to understand and that you're kind of stonewalling. You don't really want to look at it, so it ends up having to come to you through maybe someone that you love at some level. So I think we need to take it personally.
And it has to be powerful in order for it to leave a mark enough, in order to have enough impact on you to make you, to force that change to happen. It has to have a significant impact. It can't be lackadaisical or blasé. It's got to be a significant event where you are disturbed enough to take action. It's sort of that point. It's kind of like where we are in the political realm right now. We're so fed up with what's going on that we need that impetus to force us to make the change. Because without that move, without this tension, we don't get angry enough to make the move. We become complacent.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of natural to blame the other person. And there's a concept in Tibetan Buddhism called afflictive emotions. And, within Tibetan Buddhism, it's kind of commonly known that, we all have afflictive emotions like jealousy or anger. And when you feel afflictive emotions, the natural reaction is to say, well, I'm angry at you because you said something, you got angry at me and said that to me. And the whole point is that you can't really stop that cycle until you begin being compassionate towards the others, but also passionate towards yourself.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something earlier I thought that was very interesting about the idea of stagnation and how that all things need to evolve and they need to be very, organic. How does that fit into the realm of sacred architecture? I mean, sacred architecture is a footprint in the ground that, sort of says, here we are, boom, we have made a statement, this is our religious, our sacred vessel for worshiping the, whatever. Yet it's stagnant. I mean, it's not a movable feast. It's not a movable vehicle.
Well, but, I'm at a friend's house right now in the Berkshires, just outside of Great Barrington, and, she's had a kind of accident recently that was very problematic, and something needs to change. And she said, I've been thinking of putting a vegetable garden in down here, right below where I'm sitting on a little terrace outside. And I said, that's a great idea because that's a healing energy, and you're making a choice to choose to put this healing energy here.
Mm-hmm. That's all
so no matter how written in stone you think your place is, there are always ways to, change the color of a room or a door, or to, if you find out that looking at the astro feng shui that, Jupiter, which is prosperity, happens to the Jupiter line happens to go straight through your bathroom, you're in trouble, and it's a good idea to learn what to do to counteract that.
Right, and of course you can argue that, a cathedral or any sacred piece of architecture such as that is actually a living, breathing piece, even though the actual structure may be permanent. What enters and leaves every day and sort of the energy that comes with the people and the services, everything is static and it's dynamic and moving, and so it's very clear that it does have sort of an internal life of its own, much the way our bodies have an internal life.
That's the whole idea of time and orientation, which is that every single day the sun moves throughout this, 200-degree arc or 180-degree arc, depending on the time of year. And depending upon where you are in your house when certain times of the day happen, I speak to people and say, actually, your bedroom shouldn't be in the south, it should be in the north, and that maybe even a fundamental change like this can really shift your priorities. And, what I see is that it actually isn't a big deal in the end, but what does happen is that it changes someone's perspective enough so that they begin being open to really what the next stage of their development is.
Yeah, I love that analogy because I think that's very valid. I use that quite a bit with my clients, is the idea of looking through a prism. If you look through a prism and you see a spectrum of light, and you shift that spectrum of light just 1 degree, the whole thing changes. And that's simply what we're trying to talk about here, I think, in this topic, which is very valid and sort of metaphorical in that regard, because we really are talking about looking at life just a little bit differently. And when you do that, it's sort of like, taking the same road every day, we become immune to what's happening on that road if we're driving. Then you get out and you walk on that road, you begin to see things that are much different. Or if you ride a bicycle down that same road, things look different because you're looking at it from a different framework. And that whole idea opens up a whole new realm of being alive and aware and being open to different possibilities.
Absolutely. In the Sacred Landscape book, I've been using many, many different cultures to look at, and ones that are very, very different from ours that actually have great similarities. But like the Aborigine culture in Australia, they believe that going all the way back to the original creation, back to the beginning of the dream time, that the sacred beings that were on Earth left seeds in the land. They left these seeds that represent potential creativity and children and wealth and knowledge and understanding, and that the entire land is seeded with them if you can only see them and understand where they are. And you can only do that by understanding your own dream, by going into your dream and actually asking the dream time about the magic of the place where you are. Probably in your front yard or in some room in your house, there's a kind of magic that you've never explored and which is waiting for you there.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I think, one of the reasons why in astrology it's so relevant to know the birthplace. It's one of the 3 things that we ask for and we look for when we construct an astrology chart is birth time, birth date, and birthplace. Placement on the planet is significant because of where you first evolved and the influence of what's happening at the time that at your evolution and your conception and your birth all become very relevant at that time.
Absolutely.
Now, you think in your form of astrology, Tad, your astrology is much different. We haven't got a lot of time to talk about this, but would it be helpful for a person to know the placement of their conception, where they were conceived?
Well, yeah. I mean, within the feng shui way of looking at things, the astrolocation feng shui, it's fascinating because that's the place in your house where conceptions happen. And I don't mean only conceiving children, but actually creating conceptions or ideas.
With the actual person, if you knew as an individual where you were actually conceived, you could find that out from your parents. If you could figure out where you were conceived, would that placement be significant to you?
Well, I think so. Yeah,
I would too. Yeah,
I mean, it's fascinating. I was conceived in a log cabin somewhere in the West where my father was training to be a U.S. Air Force bomber pilot in the Second World War, and I've had actually dreams of that place. Way before I actually had any confirmation that was where I was conceived.
Is that place
funny because I'm drawn to places like that.
Yeah. Is it significant for you when you go there? Do you feel as if you've arrived, so to speak?
Well, I don't really know where the place itself actually is, but I've gone there in my mind or in my kind of inner awareness, and it really feels to me like going back to the beginning. And
that's more significant a place than, say, the birthplace?
I don't know whether it's more significant or not. It depends on your horoscope.
Yeah, it's just different realm. They're both beginnings, right?
In my case, the conception was very critical and very important. And
yeah. I mean, they're both beginnings. They are both an initiation, whether you conceive or whether you're actually born. They are both significant events that are the beginning of a cycle that does, in one case, conception ends with birth. Birth ends with, evolution through life until death. So these are all beginnings and endings that signify that great circle as well.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah. We've been talking today with Tad Mann. He's an architect, an astrologer, a designer, an artist, and he's written books, significant books on architecture, astrology, sacred geometry, sacred sexuality, and he's written a book on sacred architecture recently, and he's currently working on a book on sacred landscape. His work is also very visible at his website, atmann.net, N-E-T. It's the last, not .com, .net, and it's atmann with 2 N's, is his website. He's available for readings at any point in time if you want to reach out to him. I think you'll be fascinated. Some of his most significant works have been hugely influential on my own path of discovery, and I think he's a marvelous resource for all these things, and I think he's one of the few people that I know of who can really tie it all together with all this great sense of logic. So I appreciate you very much coming on today, Tad, and as always, it's a great opportunity to talk with you and catch up. So be sure you check out his website.
It's my pleasure, and we'll speak again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on. And again,
you're welcome.
atman.net is his website. I encourage you to go there and look up his books on Amazon.com, Tad Mann or AT-Man, M-A-N-N. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been Turning of the Wheel, and as always, be open to possibilities, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.chrisflisher.com. That's www.chrisflisher.com. Or email me, and you can call me at 508-517-0969. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.